My name is RJ Starr, and I'm a professor of theoretical and integrative psychology. The work I do is organized around a formal framework I created called psychological architecture. That framework is the structural account of how mind, emotion, identity, and meaning interact to shape human experience. Most of what I write, most of what I publish, and most of what I study operates within that framework. What I want to talk about today is one of the framework's most important constructs, psychological adulthood. This is a model, not a metaphor. It has a specific structural definition, it makes specific claims, and it has consequences for how we understand ourselves and the world we live in. I want to walk through it carefully because it's something often misread on first encounter, and the misreading tends to flatten what the model is actually saying. Let me start with the central claim, and then we'll work through what it means. Psychological adulthood is not the same thing as chronological adulthood. That distinction is the foundation of the entire model, and it's worth sitting with for a moment before moving on. Chronological adulthood is conferred. It happens automatically. Time passes, a birthday arrives, and the law recognizes you as an adult. That process requires nothing of you structurally. You do not have to build anything, you don't have to integrate anything. You simply cross a threshold that was determined before you were born. Psychological adulthood is constructed. It's not given by time. It's not produced automatically by socialization. It doesn't arrive because you have a career, a family, or a set of responsibilities. It's a structural achievement, meaning it has to be built, and the building requires deliberate work of a kind that most environments never ask of us and never teach. Now, the word architecture is doing real work here, so let me explain what I mean by it. When I use the language of architecture, I'm referring to the internal organization of the self, the way that cognitive processing, emotional regulation, identity, and meaning operate in relation to each other. An architecture can be integrated, meaning these systems work together as a coordinated whole. Or it can be fragmented, meaning these systems operate separately, in competition, or with very limited contact between them. Psychological adulthood in this framework describes the condition in which the four domains of psychological architecture, which are mind, emotion, identity, and meaning, have been organized into a coordinated structural system, not perfectly, not completely, but sufficiently that the person can function from an internally coherent position rather than being driven by fragmentation, reactivity, or borrowed structure. Most people who are chronological adults have not achieved this. This is not a moral judgment, it's a structural observation. The conditions under which most people are formed, the families, the schools, the institutions, the cultural environments, they don't reliably produce integrated architecture. They produce performance. They produce compliance. They produce individuals who can function within systems without having built the internal structure that would allow them to function independently of those systems. So the model has four structural dimensions, and I want to go through each one because each one is distinct and each one adds something the others don't. The first dimension, the integration of intellect and emotion. The most foundational structural requirement of psychological adulthood is the resolution of fragmentation between cognitive and emotional processing. In psychological architecture, the mind domain governs perception, interpretation, and how we process information. The emotion domain governs affective states, the felt dimension of experience, and the regulatory dynamics that shape how we respond to what we perceive. These two systems are designed to work together. In most people, they do not. The reason they do not is not mysterious. From an early age, we're trained to develop cognitive capacity. We're taught to think, to analyze, to perform academically, to demonstrate verbal and logical competence. What we are almost never taught is how to receive emotional data as legitimate signal, how to trace an emotional response back to the interpretive frame that generated it, or how to build the regulatory capacity that would allow emotion and cognition to inform each other without one overwhelming the other. The result is predictable. You end up with people who are intellectually sophisticated, but cannot account for their own emotional reactivity. And you end up with people who are emotionally intense, but can't examine the interpretive structures that are driving their reactions. Both of these are symptoms of the same structural condition: fragmentation between the cognitive and affective systems. Emotional reactivity is the diagnostic marker of this fragmentation. It is important to be precise here. Reactivity is not about being sensitive or feeling deeply. It is a structural problem. When emotion arrives without cognitive integration, the person cannot process the affective signal, cannot trace it to its source, and cannot situate it within any larger framework. The result is action that originates from the emotion itself, and that action carries the structural signature of the fragmentation that produced it. It's fast, it's narrow, and it's proportioned to internal load rather than to the actual situation. There is also a mirror image of this problem that is just as common and often more difficult to see. Suppression is widely mistaken for emotional regulation, but they are not the same thing. Many people who appear emotionally controlled have not achieved integration. They have achieved suppression, which means they have quarantined their emotional data rather than incorporated it. The emotional signal does not disappear when it's suppressed, it accumulates. The architecture that looks composed from the outside is operating without the data that the emotional system was generating, and the dysregulation that suppression was meant to prevent continues to develop beneath the surface. What the structural achievement requires is something distinct from both reactivity and suppression. It's the presence of a functional interface between emotional data and cognitive processing, a capacity to receive the effective signal without being overwhelmed by it, to examine the frames that generated the specific emotional response, and to act from a position that integrates both. This is not a personality trait, it is a structural capacity, and it has to be built. The second dimension, radical accountability as load-bearing structure. The second structural dimension is accountability, and I want to be careful about how I use that word here, because what the model means by it is more specific and more structural than how the word is usually used. Accountability in this framework is not a virtue. It's not a behavioral commitment or a moral disposition. It's the load-bearing element of the entire self-structure. A self-structure that does not include operative accountability cannot sustain coherence under pressure. It has no internal mechanism for absorbing and processing the weight of its own failures, contradictions, and dysregulation. So it distributes that weight outward onto circumstances, onto other people, onto conditions that it can't control. And the consequence of that is chronic instability. Because if your sense of coherence depends on external conditions being favorable, and ordinary life does not consistently provide favorable conditions, then the structure is going to destabilize constantly. There is a distinction here that matters enormously and is often collapsed. Accountability for external conditions is one thing. Accountability for internal processing is something else entirely. Psychological adulthood does not require that you caused everything that happened to you. Many circumstances are not caused by the person who has to deal with them. What it requires is that you own the internal architecture through which those circumstances are interpreted, metabolized, and acted upon. The interpretive frame is internally generated. The emotional response is internally generated. The meaning assigned to the situation is internally generated. The behavioral choice that follows is internally generated. None of those can be outsourced to external cause without abandoning the structural position from which coherent action becomes possible. Projection, in this analysis, is a structural failure rather than a personality flaw. When emotional dysregulation is consistently narrated as caused by other people or by external circumstances, the person has placed the source of their own internal state outside themselves. The internal condition then becomes dependent on external management, which is to say, it becomes dependent on conditions the person doesn't control. The architecture that has externalized its accountability has surrendered the means of its own regulation. I also want to address something the model treats with particular care, which is the question of identities organized around harm. This requires precision because it's easy to misread, and the misreading causes real damage. Being harmed is real. It requires no qualification and no minimization. Many people have been harmed in ways that had lasting consequences, and the model does not contest this and does not assign responsibility for the harm to those who experienced it. What requires structural attention is the difference between having been harmed and organizing your identity around the harm. An identity organized around harm is an identity whose structural coherence depends on the continued centrality of the injury. The injury becomes the load-bearing element of the self-structure, and the structure cannot release the injury without losing its own coherence. That is a structural trap. It's not a moral failing, and treating it as a moral failing produces neither clarity nor change. What a self-structure looks like when radical accountability is operative is not a structure characterized by self-blame or by the denial of external influence. It's a structure that retains interpretive authority over its own interior under all conditions. It asks not only what happened, but what it is doing with what happened. It distinguishes between the event and the response. It does not require favorable conditions to maintain coherence because its coherence is generated internally. That is the load-bearing function. Without it, the structure cannot hold its shape under weight, and everything else the model describes depends on this one. The third dimension, structural tolerance for ambiguity. The third structural capacity is the ability to maintain coherence under conditions of genuine complexity, contradiction, and unresolved tension. I'm calling this structural tolerance, and I want to be clear that it's not tolerance in any interpersonal or moral sense. It's architectural. The capacity of the self-structure to hold competing truths without collapsing them into a false resolution, and to sustain functional output while operating in conditions of genuine ambiguity. The cognitive and affective load of unresolved complexity is real. Ambiguity is genuinely uncomfortable. An architecture that cannot bear that load will reduce it through structural means. And the most common form that reduction takes is what I call binary collapse. Binary collapse is the structural reduction of complex, multivalent realities into two-valued systems. It's not a failure of intelligence. It's a structural defense against the load that ambiguity imposes. When the architecture cannot sustain the tension of competing truths, it resolves the tension by eliminating one pole. The result is a simplified system that is stable but inaccurate. And here's what makes this particularly important. The more sophisticated the cognitive resources available, the more elaborate and persuasive the binaries become. An intelligent person doing binary collapse produces very convincing binaries. The intelligence does not prevent the structural failure. It dresses it up. Cognitive rigidity is the visible signature of the structural condition. Rigidity is widely mistaken for strength, for conviction, for principled commitment. It is none of those things. It is the structural condition of a system that can only maintain itself by excluding complexity. The rigid person is not displaying depth. They are displaying the structural limit of the architecture they have built. Beyond that limit, the architecture cannot operate. And rigidity is what the architecture does to keep itself within its operable range. The demand for certainty follows the same logic. It exists not because certainty is epistemically justified, but because uncertainty generates structural instability. The demand for certainty is a diagnostic indicator. It marks a self structure whose coherence depends on the elimination of competing interpretations. An architecture that can sustain uncertainty does not need to demand certainty. I want to name something here that has consequences well beyond the individual, which is that polarization at the social and political level is the externalization of this internal limitation at scale. When a population whose architectures cannot bear ambiguity encounters genuine complexity, the population produces binary collapse collectively. The collapse is not primarily ideological in origin, even though it's expressed through ideological content. It is structural in origin. Two valued political and cultural systems offer the relief that complex systems do not. They reduce the load. The polarization we observe is the trace of the structural failure that produced it, which is why it appears across ideological positions and across historical periods. The structural condition is constant, even when the content of the binaries change. Structural tolerance, the achieved capacity here, is not passive acceptance of complexity or sophisticated relativism. It's an active structural achievement. A self-structure built with sufficient internal load-bearing capacity to remain coherent while carrying the weight of genuine uncertainty. The person who has achieved this can hold competing truths, sustain unresolved questions, and inhabit irreducible complexity without destabilization. This does not prevent the formation of positions. It allows positions to be held without requiring the elimination of competing positions. Now, the fourth dimension, autonomy from the collective. The fourth structural capacity is the transition from externally derived identity and meaning to internally organized structure. This is the dimension that most people find most challenging to hear clearly because it's easy to confuse with a kind of individualism or contrarianism that the model is not describing at all. So let me be careful. Most individuals, regardless of age, construct their sense of self through continuous reference to collective mirrors, social groups, cultural narratives, the feedback of others, the signals of belonging and approval. This is the default condition, and it's not a personal failure. It's the rational architectural output of environments that provide abundant external mirrors and very few conditions for internal development. The problem is structural. An identity organized primarily through external mirrors has its coherence located outside the self. And when the external signals are stable and favorable, the structure operates as if it were robust, because the scaffolding is doing the work of an internal organization that was never built. When the signals are withdrawn, challenged, or contradicted, the structure destabilizes. And the destabilization is often experienced as an identity crisis, which is an accurate description of what's happening. The identity, as constituted, was never organized internally. The apparent crisis is the appearance of a structural condition that was always present but was previously masked by favorable external conditions. The conditions of contemporary life make this worse in specific and measurable ways. Algorithmic systems are optimized to capture and sustain attention through the continuous delivery of social signal, feedback, comparison, and reactive material. These systems reward external orientation and effectively penalize internal differentiation. The individual who relies on internal structures for identity coherence generates less engagement than the individual who is continuously negotiating their position within a reactive social field. The environment in which contemporary identity formation occurs is more saturated with external mirrors than any prior environment in human history. And that saturation is not accidental. It is the operating condition of systems whose economics depend on it. Collective emotional contagion is the direct consequence of this architecture at scale. An identity structured primarily around external validation is structurally vulnerable to collective emotional states. because the collective is the source of the validation on which the identity depends. When the collective is frightened, the externally organized individual becomes frightened. When the collective is outraged, the individual becomes outraged. This is not empathy, and the distinction matters structurally. Empathy is the capacity of an internally organized system to register and respond to the emotional state of another while maintaining its own structural coherence. Contagion is the transmission of emotional state through a population whose individual architectures lack the internal regulation that would allow them to register the collective state without being captured by it. The two phenomena look similar and differ structurally in fundamental ways. Internally organized structure is not individualism in any ideological sense. It is the structural condition of an identity that has a sufficient internal center to remain coherent in the absence of or in contradiction to external validation. The person who has achieved this architecture can engage the collective without being organized by it. They can participate in social life, receive social feedback, and inhabit collective contexts without any of those things constituting the primary structure of the self. This dimension is closely connected to the meaning domain in psychological architecture. An internally organized identity requires an internally organized meaning system, a framework for understanding purpose, value, and direction that is constructed rather than inherited, examined rather than assumed. And I want to be precise here as well. The model does not advocate discarding inherited meaning. Inherited meaning structures contain accumulated material that has organized human life across long historical periods, and simply discarding them does not produce autonomy. It produces a vacuum that fills with whatever ambient meaning the environment happens to supply, which is often no better and frequently worse. What is required is the examination of inherited meaning and its deliberate reconstruction, the movement from received meaning to owned meaning. This is one of the most demanding structural achievements of psychological adulthood because it requires the architecture to operate on its own meaning system from a position outside it, while the meaning system itself is what was providing the support for that position. It is structurally costly work, which is part of why it is rarely undertaken. Now, I'd like to talk about the societal dimension. I want to spend a few minutes on what this model implies beyond the individual, because the framework does not stop at the boundary of the self. What appears at the societal level as political dysfunction, cultural fragmentation, and institutional brittleness is, at its structural base, the aggregate expression of individual architectural incompletion. Now, I want to be careful not to overstate that claim or flatten out the real complexity of political and social life, but the structural pattern is legible, and it's worth naming directly. A society composed predominantly of psychological minors is structurally predisposed toward polarization, not because its members disagree, but because its members lack the structural capacity to hold disagreement without destabilization. When an identity organized around external validation encounters opposition, that opposition is not experienced as a position to be considered or contested. It is experienced as a structural threat, an attack on the conditions the identity requires for its own continued coherence. The response to a perceived structural attack is necessarily defensive, and the defensive response escalates rather than deliberates. The political becomes personal, not as a rhetorical failure, but as a structural fact. Institutions designed to function through deliberation, compromise, and the sustained engagement with complexity require participants who can tolerate ambiguity, regulate reactivity, and exercise internal accountability. Those are precisely the structural capacities whose absence this model describes. When those capacities are rare in the population, the institutions that require them cannot continue to function as designed. They adapt, simplify, fragment. What we observe across contemporary public life is some combination of all three. The systems that reinforce this condition are worth naming as well. Media systems reward reactivity over analysis because reactivity generates the engagement the systems are optimized to capture. Political systems reward binary positioning because binary positioning produces the coalitional clarity that electoral structures require. Educational systems train cognitive performance while neglecting the emotional and identity architectures that psychological adulthood requires, because cognitive performance is what those systems can measure and credential. The result is a self reinforcing structural condition, a collective environment that systematically prevents the development of the individual architecture it most needs. The framework does not propose a remedy for what it describes. That is a deliberate theoretical choice I made, not an evasion. Psychological adulthood is a structural achievement, and structural achievements are not produced by exhortation, by programming, or by policy. The absence of psychological adulthood is an architectural condition with architectural consequences, and the work appropriate to it is structural analysis, examining the conditions that produce incompletion, the domains whose integration constitutes the achievement, and the collective costs of a society in which that integration remains the exception rather than the rule. Let me close by returning to the central claim because I think it's worth stating plainly one more time. Psychological adulthood is not a stage of life. It's not a reward for effort or a sign of character. It is not something that arrives with age or with the accumulation of education or experience. It's a structural achievement in a precise and technical sense. The degree to which the four domains of psychological architecture, mind, emotion, identity, and meaning, have been organized into a coordinated, internally coherent system that can sustain coherence under pressure, hold genuine complexity without collapsing it, and operate from an internally generated center rather than from borrowed or reactive structures. Most people have not achieved it. That is not an indictment of those people. It is an observation about the conditions under which most architectures are formed, and those conditions do not favor the work. The work is demanding. It is rarely supported, and it does not generate the kind of visible output that the environments we inhabit tend to reward. But precision about the condition is not a small thing. It is the prerequisite for any serious engagement with what the structure actually contains. And it's what makes possible the recognition of conditions that less precise analyses routinely misname. That's what this model is intended to provide. Not a remedy, not a program, but a precise structural account of what psychological adulthood is, what it requires, and what its absence costs. Now, if you want to go further with this, my formal paper is available for download. It's called Psychological Adulthood, a construct introduction for structural integration across the domains of mind, emotion, identity, and meaning. You can find it on my website along with the full psychological architecture framework and all of my published work at profrjstarr.com. The page for this construct is specifically at profrjstarr.com/psychological-adulthood. Thank you for your time with this.